coming here, and also Pam Moon, who I think is on the ladies' side. She should be with us soon as well, bringing this wonderful exhibition that you see behind us. So, as an introduction to Barrie, he was part of the 1978 STURP team that first examined the shroud, the first ever scientific examination of the shroud. He was the official documenting photographer of that, and he's also owner of Shroud.com, which gathers all the information, the biggest website online about the shroud, the definitive website with all the information you could want on the shroud. So he's the leading expert as far as I'm concerned, and we're very fortunate to have him here. So we did a special edition, and I think other copies of it will be available in May of the Review of Religions, which featured 2 of his articles, and we've got copies we can give out. And off the back of that, we invited him to the event, and he graciously accepted. He's here now, and he's going to present to you. So I'll hand over to Barrie.
How are you this afternoon? And thank you, by the way, Arif. It's good. I just want to clarify one thing. I am no longer the owner of Shroud.com or any of the original photography. 6 years ago, I formed a non-profit organization. I didn't want people to think that I was doing this about money. You know about stereotypes, okay? See, you got it. No, there were people who thought that's why I was doing this. So to alleviate that, and also to indemnify my son so that when my time comes and I pass, that he doesn't have to try and sort out what to do with everything, I've legally transferred it over to the nonprofit. So technically I'm no longer the owner. I made the photographs, I did own them, but now they belong to our nonprofit, Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, or STERA. Now, because time is short, and because I was just informed moments ago that I will be getting to speak for a few moments in the large tent, the large marquee, I think is what we call them, right? So I'm going to go very fast, and I'm not going to go into much detail because there isn't time. And getting me started is easy, getting me to stop is difficult. So I will start quickly by showing you a photograph. Oh, wait a minute, got to turn it on first, technology. Let's see if it's working. Okay, normally this is what I use to demonstrate and talk about the shroud, but because Pam brought her beautiful exhibit, and Pam just arrived. Hi, Pam. Pam brought her beautiful exhibit, which includes my photography, the life-size replica, and the ventral dorsal black and white views. One of, I think, 12 boards, isn't that correct? 12, Pam? Something like that. So obviously there was only room for a small amount of it here, but this is the important thing. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about the shroud so that I can basically give you a general indication of what's there. Because when you first look at the Shroud of Turin, it's pretty subtle. The images, you know, when you look at the shroud, you don't really even see the important part, because all you see are these big scorchy lines that are running down the length of the cloth, and those are burns and scorches from a fire in 1532. What's really important is what's between them. And, you know, the shroud was just on public display in Turin just a month or two ago, and this explanation should help it. The image is very subtle on the shroud. People look at it and they go, I don't even hardly see it. And Pam always points to this area, which is the face, but of course you can see that better on the black and white high contrast view. Sorry we're blocking it with this, but necessary. And so what's really critically important isn't all the obvious markings, but those that are much more subtle, which is the image of a man who has been crucified, crowned with a cap of thorns, speared in the side, whipped with a Roman flagrum, both, not just the back of his body, by the way, but the front. And this is another argument that I have in favor of its authenticity rather than being an artwork. Typically, artists who depict the flogging of Jesus in their artworks show his back ripped up. But guess what? If you're standing behind somebody and you hit him with a whip, if you take just a half step closer, those thongs are going to come around and they're going to hit the front of the body as well. And no artist that I'm aware of has ever depicted that. But if you look at this, you'll see that the scourge marks are on the front as well as the back of the body. Another indication that this isn't some artistic interpretation, but a more accurate, forensically accurate view of a man who's had these tortures applied. So quickly, let's see what the images are. This photo here is of an artwork that sort of explains how an image could appear on a sheet of cloth head to head, which is what we see on the shroud. This is a Della Rovere painting from, I don't remember, 16th century. But the cloth, the man would have been laid in the cloth with his feet at one end, it would have then been wrapped back up over his head and back to his feet. Now, some of my Christian friends say, wait a minute, in the New Testament it says there were linen strips, and they somehow think that that would imply he was wrapped like a mummy. And that's why they say, well, the shroud can't be real, because in the Gospels it says linen strips. Well, if I wrap a body like this, and I intend to move it at all, this cloth's just going to fall right off, so that they would bind the body into the shroud with linen strips. So what it says in the Gospels is correct, but has been misinterpreted by many people into accept. By the way, by the 1st century, even the Egyptians had stopped wrapping mummies in strips. So in the 1st century, that wouldn't have even been an option. Now, nobody knew much about the shroud, and you know what, I'm going to let you go up afterwards and take a look at the artwork there that points to the various markings on the cloth, so I can get through this as fast as possible, and I'm sorry to have to do that, but time is of the essence. So nobody knew much about the shroud until 1898, when this gentleman on the left, Secondo Pio, was allowed to make the very first photographs ever of the Shroud of Turin. And what was interesting, he had to use this little camera, which, as you'll see in a little bit, is huge. And I'm glad when I talk to you, I'm looking at the group, there are very few kids in the room, little kids, because a year or two ago I was lecturing to a group of 10-year-old kids, and I was talking about film, and finally a little boy put his hand up and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Schwortz, film, is that a USB device?" And made me feel pretty old. Anyway, Secondo Pio was given the privilege of making the first photograph, and because he made that photograph, because that could then be reproduced and published and distributed, for the first time in history, people outside of pretty much just northern Italy got to learn about the shroud. So we always look at his photograph as sort of the opening of the scientific era of the shroud. Now, of course, this is what he saw. It looked like this to him when he looked through the ground glass of the camera. But of course, there was no color film in 1898. He had to shoot on black and white film. And so this is what the film recorded. And when Secondo Pio looked at this, he realized something that no one had ever realized about the shroud image before. What's here is a negative. The lights and darks are reversed from what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing light highlights, dark shadows. And yet that's the inverse of what's on the shroud. So when you photograph it onto negative film, which again inverts it, then you get this image, which suddenly takes on a much more realistic characteristic. And here, let's look at it this way. And I'm going to go through these pretty quick, but you can clearly see the face. You can see the two cheekbones, one more swollen than the other. You can see, and let's see, if I push the button, it'll help. You'll see bloodstains covering the head, not in a pretty crown the way artists have always depicted it, because no Roman soldier is going to weave a crown for this criminal you're about to execute. They're not going to make him look pretty. They smashed a thorn bush onto his head because they were trying to humiliate him and add to his suffering and torture. And so we have the scalp covered with wounds, which is probably much more accurate than the artworks we've seen with the pretty little circlet. We have this line here that we can see on this is simply a crease in the cloth. But when you convert it to black and white and increase the contrast, it just becomes a line. And some people have misinterpreted that as some part of the image, which of course it's not. It's just a physical aberration of the cloth, which they used to roll up on a dowel and keep in a casket, a wooden casket, for centuries. So that crease was pressed in very tight, and even when we photographed it in 78, we tried to smooth it out. It was impossible. Anyway, continuing on quickly, we have this spear wound, which I can point to here, and it might be difficult for you to see it on this side. Spear wound with a blood flow below it. And I'm going to point out on the other half of the shroud, the back or dorsal view, that blood flow went around to the small of the back because of gravity and pulled at the small of the back. And that's nothing that a medieval artist could have even conceived of, let alone incorporated into an artwork. Not even Leonardo da Vinci. And I bring that up because somebody from the UK in 1995 wrote a book claiming that Leonardo da Vinci made this photographically, which I thought was a joke until I found out there was really such a book that claimed that. And I had to point out to my friend who mentioned it to me that the shroud is being publicly displayed 100 years before the birth of Leonardo da Vinci. He was a good artist, but he wasn't that good. So, anyway, continuing on, we have the spear wound. Again, everything in concordance with what it tells us in the New Testament was done to Jesus. We can see his arms crossed, and we can see blood stains coming down the arms. Some people have claimed that they can detect two different positions in the blood flows. That's not my field of expertise. I'll mention that to you, and you can do a little research and find out that that's what some people claim. Here we have the wrist wound, the blood stain at the back of the wrist. Now I say wrist, it's actually not the center of the palm the way artists typically depict it, but probably just about an inch below. Sorry for inches, I'm American, you know, we don't know the metric system. About an inch below the center of the palm, so it's still the palm. So it's not wrong if somebody writes that it's in the palm of the hand, but it's just a little bit below, because if you do this, and probably the Roman soldiers who had to do the dirty work of nailing someone to a cross figured the easiest way to do it, so it was less, because it couldn't have been much fun for them either. If you do this, you've got a perfect little spot to put a nail, you drive it through, and it also goes through a part of the wrist that wouldn't break any bones, but would secure the hand to the cross so that a strong man couldn't tear himself loose. That was really the main reason for that. We have these patches, which are the result of that fire. You can see them here. They run up and down. The fire was in 1532. It was repaired in 1534. We also have these markings. You can see one here, and you can see more of them. There's one there, down here. And these are water stains. Ostensibly, we all thought that they came from the 1532 fire, but there is some research that points out that they may be much earlier than that. Perhaps the theory is that the shroud was rolled up and put in a tall jar, like an olive jar, so that it could be hidden, because in the 1st century, iconoclasts looking to destroy any kind of Christian relics, had they found it, it would have been destroyed. And remember, Jewish law, like Muslim law, says no depictions, and not only that, it's a blood-soaked cloth. Jewish law says it must be buried with the body. So the disciples, when they found the tomb empty and found the cloth, couldn't come running out and say, look what we found, because they might have been the next ones on a cross. So it had to be hidden, and for the first few hundred years, there's really no evidence as to where it might have been. But my friend Aldo, who did his research, duplicated the shroud, put it in an olive jar, allowed the water to go in there, and he came up with stains very close to what's on the Shroud of Turin. So you can see that there's not definitive answers to every question. As a matter of fact, our team, which went to Turin to answer a single question, how is the image formed, came back with 1,000 new questions, and the inability to answer how the image was formed. We did go there looking for paint. We went there looking for possibly photographic material, and we also went there to determine whether or not it was a scorch, because those were the first 3 sort of suggested possibilities of how the image formed. I will say that our data at the end of our presentation, you'll see it, basically our data said it's not a painting. We found no paint, and we used pyrolysis mass spectrometry and spectrographic analysis and ultraviolet fluorescence. So we used all these scientific things. And basically, we determined it wasn't a painting, it wasn't a photograph, and it wasn't a scorch, but we didn't know of any mechanism that could make an image with the chemical and physical properties we find on the shroud. So continuing on quickly, we have bloodstains at the feet. We cannot tell if it was 3 nails used to nail him to the cross or 4, but you'll see on Pam's board over here, the ankle bone of a man named Jehohanan, a 1st century man who had been crucified, and they nailed him 1 nail in each foot through the side of the ankle into the vertical stanchion or stipes of the cross. So my Catholic friends like the idea of 3 nails because it goes with the Trinity, which is part of their faith, but the archaeological evidence seems to be pointing to 4. And I always say at this point, does it matter whether it was 3 or 4? Look what they did to him. Isn't that what this is about? They crucified him. How many nails wasn't really the issue. Okay, and here's the back. We're going to take a quick look. Now, you can clearly now see these blood stains up here that cover the scalp. And again, artists don't depict Jesus that way. They have a pretty little, circlet around his head. We have the scourge marks going down the body. Let me just back up just for a second. I want you to look at the scourge marks that you can see on his chest, on his torso, on his thighs. This is not the way artists depict the beating of Jesus. Continuing on. We have the scourge marks. We have some burn holes here that predate the 1532 fire. We know that from the copies of the shroud that were made prior to them that show those L-shaped burn holes. So we don't know what exactly caused them. We just know they predate the big fire that caused all the big damage. We have scourge marks down to the calves. So he was literally beaten from his neck down to his ankles. And we have scourge marks to prove evidence of that. And we see, and we can see it really pretty clearly. I don't think my microphone cable's long enough to get there. You can see a bloody footprint and the back of a heel. And if you look here, you can see the footprint and the back of the heel. So the toes would be sort of pointing away from us on this foot. And I'm not sure how well you can see that from the back. This is more of a closer look at the scourge wounds, particularly on the back. So certainly that was where they were aiming for when they started to beat him. But obviously they literally beat him from head to toe. This is what a flagrum looks like. And here's a close-up of a few flagrum wounds from the shroud. And you can see that these dumbbell-shaped weights, one of which has been found in Herculaneum, by the way, so that we do know that this is a credible depiction of what would be on the end of a flagrum. Here we have some of these wounds in close-ups. You can see that they pretty much match the shape of what was found. Now, our team got started because of this device. Now, I used to say, oh, this looks like an old stereo tuner. But if you say that to a 10-year-old, you get a blank stare, because if it isn't an iPad, then they don't know what it is. But this is the device that sort of prompted our team to get started. And what we did was, they took a photograph of the shroud, and they put it in this device. You input it with a black and white video camera. And then there's a green screen display, and with all these knobs and dials, you can control, and it takes the luminance, or the lights and darks of the image, and it extends them vertically into three-dimensional space. And these are video clips made directly from... Who's beeping? Is that me? This is taken right off the screen of a VP8. You can, and it's coarse because the 8 stands for 8 bits, which means only an 8-bit grayscale, so it's a rather coarse image, not very refined. But when you turn up and down the gain, there comes a point, and we can see that a little better here, where you get the natural relief of a human form. Now, the misunderstanding from the skeptics on this is, well, any image will give you 3D. Yeah, that's true, because the VP8 will take any light or dark and stretch it vertically into space based on its density. Absolutely. But a normal photograph does not yield the natural relief of a human form, and yet the shroud did. So when they saw this, a couple of scientists said, let's put a team together, see if we can get permission, let's go to Italy, and let's see if we can figure out how this image was formed. Because this characteristic is not typical of photography artworks, either one. This is not something we can easily accomplish using either of those techniques. So that's what was the catalyst for the team. Now, here's a normal photograph. They move. Just to show you, notice the little boy here. Notice his hair is going deep down into his head. See this? Notice his nose and his cheeks are flat. And let's face it, the nose protrudes further than the cheeks, but we're not seeing that here, although we did on the shroud image. Notice that his mouth is so distorted that he looks like a little monster out of a horror movie. And this other kid, I don't even know what to say about him, but... So you can see that we don't get the same natural relief in a normal photograph that we would with the shroud. But we can go into the darkroom, and thank God I can say darkroom, and you know what I'm talking about. I said that to 10-year-olds, and the kid said, yeah, well, my room's dark when my mom turns out the light when I go to bed. But in the darkroom, where we're no longer limited to an 8-bit grayscale, and we have a much more continuous tone kind of image, now look at the face. Notice the features. This is not manipulated in the computer. This is done in a darkroom. This information is actually encoded in the shroud. You can see the arms crossing the torso. You can see the fingers. You can see the knees all the way to the feet, the back of the head, the shoulders, the buttocks. And there is some flattening of the back of the shoulders and buttocks, indicating he was lying flat on his back when the image formed. And look at the calves. I mean, it's very clear, and much more so in this image than in the VP8. But the VP8 was the catalyst for us to go over there and do our examination. We live in a digital age, so here's a digital rendition of the face, same information, done using a third, completely different technique. I've shown you 3 ways now where you can extract this data and visualize that there is topographical or spatial information encoded into the image of the shroud. Now, our team decided to get together. The first thing they did, I had done a 7-month project for Los Alamos National Laboratories as a photographic consultant. The guy I worked with for 7 months, a few weeks later, he'd been there when they did the VP8, called me up and he said, "Barrie, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And I kind of laughed and I said, "But Don, I'm Jewish." And Don laughed and he said, "So am I, remember?" He was one of the other Jewish guys on our team. And he was an imaging scientist. He was the guy I did the atomic bomb stuff with for Los Alamos. And he asked me to join the team and I said no, because I felt uncomfortable. Well, I was a young guy, I was 31 or 32 years old. I didn't have the confidence that I have now, or the knowledge. So I said no, I didn't want to join the team, but ultimately the image properties sucked me in. And I did join the team. So we spent 17 months planning our experiments, packaged up our equipment, shipped 80 crates of equipment over to Turin, got on an airplane, went over there to examine the shroud. Now, backing up for a moment, this is the dry run. This is the first time our team met together as a full team. We worked in regional groups. There was a California group, a Colorado group, a New Mexico group, and a New England group where most of our medical guys came from. And so here we decided we would design and fabricate a special steel table so we could fasten the cloth to it by magnets so we wouldn't cause it any harm. And here we are just sort of testing out the equipment and tables at a dry run a month before we went to Italy. So we go to Italy. Here's the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. Adjoining that is the Guarini Chapel. Literally, you could walk through behind the main altar of the cathedral right into the chapel where the shroud was typically stored. And the square building behind it is the Royal Palace where we'd ultimately would examine the cloth. And because the shroud in 1978 was the 400th anniversary of it arriving in Turin in 1578, they put it on public display. And you can see there's quite a number of people there until you look down here at the far left. And if we look just a little closer, 100,000 people in a queue waiting as long as 10 hours to see this piece of cloth. I was baffled at the time. I just couldn't figure out why anybody would want to do that. The good news is, in more recent years, thanks to the invention of the internet, now you can go online when they have a public display, make your own reservations, and the queues are barely there. It's much more efficient, fast, thanks to the internet. So, you see, there are some good things about the internet. Anyway, we get to Turin, and the public display is still going on. We arrive a week early to unpack our equipment and get everything ready in the Royal Palace where we were to examine the shroud. This is the way it looks in the on display in the Royal Palace at the time. This is the chapel behind it where the shroud was typically stored in this behind this grating in the altar of the chapel. And right out the back door of the Guarini Chapel, you walk right into the Royal Palace. This is the casket, the wooden box that it was kept in, rolled up on a dowel, wrapped in red silk, and then in asbestos. Not a very good thing, but that's what they used to do. In 1997, they restored the dome of the Guarini Chapel. It had been falling down, pieces were falling, and somebody was going to get killed. They remodeled it. They moved the shroud out into the cathedral. As the shroud was out in the cathedral, they finished the dome. Everything was fine. And in 1997, an arsonist goes in, sets a fire, and completely destroys the Guarini Chapel, damages the cathedral and the Royal Palace. The shroud is rescued. You can go online on YouTube or on Shroud.com. You can find it, the 1997 fire, and watch the video of the fireman who nobody told the fireman that a 9-pound hammer could not break bulletproof glass. So he grabbed a 9-pound hammer, went in, broke the bulletproof glass, and rescued the shroud. You know? And somebody asked him, "How did you do that?" He said, "God helped." Couldn't argue with him on that one. After that, they realized maybe a wooden box isn't the best place to keep this relic. So they created a new reliquary. It's a big box. The shroud isn't rolled, it's kept flat. It's in a nitrogen argon atmosphere, temperature and humidity controlled. Fireproof. It's a steel cabinet, thick glass, but kept flat. So the stresses on rolling and unrolling it certainly aren't good for it. this is what you would see in the cathedral today. You cannot see the shroud, but you can go in and you can see the reliquary itself. So now we're in Turin. We arrive, and the very first good news we're given is all your equipment has been seized by Italian customs, and they refuse to release it because we had an X-ray machine, and the X-ray machine on the outside of the crate had a radiation sticker. Apparently put the fear of God into the Italian customs officials. They wouldn't release it. There was an Italian priest who lived in America, born in Turin, been an altar boy at the cathedral in 1931 when the shroud had been last shown, Father Peter Rinaldi. Father Peter, since he was born there, was our liaison with the Turin authorities and the king. He decided, I will go to the customs and I'll get the equipment out. And Father Peter was kind of a big guy with a pretty booming voice. And he was a priest, of course. Father Peter goes down to the customs office. He says, who's the man in charge? The guy comes out. First thing Father says is, what is your name? Now the guy's a little suspect, a little nervous. He goes, well, why do you want my name, Father? And Father Peter says, because there's about to be an international incident and I'd like to give you personal credit for it. And then he slipped him 100,000 lira. Now it sounds like a lot of money. It was $80. That's why the Italians were so happy to go to the euro. It took so many lira to make a dollar. Anyway, Father Peter gets the equipment released and he immediately, oh, there I am. Sorry, I forgot about these. I'm jumping ahead. There's me next to Pia's camera, and I'll finish this last part of the story in a minute. I used to say, look, modern technology and next to this old tech, now both obsolete, both use film. Old news. Now, they let us into the palace even though we didn't have our equipment. And since I'm from Pittsburgh and not a place that has too many palaces, I went around making some photos. This is the fresco in what we called the equipment maintenance room, which had actually been a bedroom for visiting royalty when the palace was still a palace. It was a museum by the time we got there. This is the fresco in the room in which we examined the shroud. Now, you remember that fire I told you about? I made these just for myself, just because I thought it was cool and look how beautiful this is. But in 1998, a year after the fire, when the shroud had been rescued, and the fire and smoke and water damage to the palace where we examined the cloth had caused great damage to these, mostly smoke and water damage, I was given the honor, the opportunity and the honor to present to the Archbishop these photographs, which they could then use to help restore the frescoes back to their... Isn't that the way God works, though? I made this for myself. There was no purpose in these other than my own edification, and yet 20 years later they become important in the help of restoring that part of the palace that was damaged. So then they load all of our equipment on a dump truck. And so this is in the courtyard of the royal palace, and I'm making this photo and I'm thinking any moment the guy's going to pull the lever and dump our instruments on the ground. Somebody actually ran up to him and said, don't dump the equipment. And he looked at him, of course not. You guys unpack it. So we unpacked it and we moved our equipment in. I'm going to go as fast as I can through these because we had to get our gear. Now, we'd gotten there a week early. The plan was to get all the equipment ready, so when they brought the shroud, everything was set up. Now we lost 5 days, actually 5.5. So that 1.5 days after we got our equipment, we worked around the clock to get the equipment set up and ready so that when they brought us the shroud, we would be prepared. Problem was, ever been to Italy, anybody? Well, you know how things run in Italy. A little late. All right, a lot late sometimes, let's be honest. So imagine our surprise when the equipment, somebody yells, here comes the shroud, and they bring it down the hallway an hour and a half ahead of schedule. In the meantime, this is that equipment maintenance room again, and I just want to point out this water hose. We had one instrument that required water cooling. This was pre-solid state electronics, so heat temperature was an issue. Well, I'm looking from the hallway into this room, and to my left is a long hall that goes way down. At the far end is the only operating bathroom in the royal palace, or at least in that half where we were permitted. So we had to buy a bunch of garden hoses, string them from the bathroom all the way up the hall, through the equipment maintenance room, through this doorway here to the right, into the room where we examine the shroud, and there you can see the hoses coming right in there at the bottom. It's not exactly the laboratory setting you might have expected. So anyway, we also had to cover all the windows because we were doing thermal or infrared imaging. Too bad the infrared sensors in 1978 weren't as good as we have today. You realize that there's now an app for your phone that's a thermal imaging camera? I just saw it advertised on BBC last night. This is the camera rail system. They're measuring the distance, and we sandbag this rail in place. Because look at the size of this. You can't photograph the whole thing. The room wasn't deep enough for me to get back far enough, and then the image wouldn't be as good. So I photographed half at a time, but that rail was, once it was measured and put in place, I could do one half of the photograph here, slide the camera along the rail, and do the second half. 20 years later, when I had the images scanned and digitized so that I could put them together in Photoshop, when I put them together, it was a perfect match. Because these men, in that 17-month planning session, designed and fabricated this camera support system, which allowed for that level of accuracy. So here it is. Now they're bringing the shroud down the hallway an hour and a half ahead of schedule. Here we are. They're already unraveling the shroud. Ah, that steel table we brought with us was made of steel, not stainless, because apparently there's some chemical composition in stainless that might be harmful to the cloth. So they made it plain steel, but then they realized plain steel can corrode, and sure enough, we got it unpacked, and there was a white powdery corrosion on the surface of all the steel panels. And the reason they're removable panels is we were going to do x-rays as well. So here we are now. Notice that's gold foil. Gold foil mylar, the same material used in cargo bay of the space shuttle and in satellites, because we had 2 NASA team members from the Jet Propulsion Lab. And when I'm in America, I always point out, because this is very expensive stuff, I always point out your tax dollars at work, but not yours, only the Americans. So here we are. There's Unwrapping the Shroud. Look, we're still not even finished covering those panels, and the shroud's already in the room. They brought it early. This is the cloth upon, the white wooden board upon which the shroud had been fastened for public display. I'm going to go through this quick. Anybody want to guess? Now, some of you have already heard me say this. You know how they fastened the Shroud of Turin to this piece of white painted wood to put it on public display? Now, I understand that in the UK, they don't call them thumbtacks. I'm not sure, does anyone know what the equivalent would be? It's a little flat tack with a pin sticking out the back.
Drawing pins.
Drawing pins, okay. So you know that they used about 100 of them to fasten this piece of cloth. So it's like they crucified the shroud 100 times. And of course, every time they pulled one out, little circle of rust with a rusty hole in the middle. We've all seen that, because they're not made out of stainless steel, they're made out of cheap metal. And imagine, we build a table, design and fabricate a steel table that articulates and does all this other stuff, removable panels, and they nail it to a piece of wood. We were a little shocked at that.
Barrie, 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to just whip through a bunch of pictures real quick. You're seeing that we're moving cloth on to our table. Those white things around the periphery, those are the magnets. They're white because they're coated in Teflon. We did not want to let one particle of metal from the magnet even get on the cloth. So every magnet was coated with Teflon. This gentleman was given the opportunity to go first. He bought the cheapest dime store sticky tape he could find, and he starts sticking it down with his thumb all over the shroud. Every place he put his sticky tape, he left gum on the surface of the cloth that 20 years later had collected dust and dirt, and there were little dirty squares, and they had to be removed, cleaned. Look at the pressure he's putting on. Again, we were appalled. We also had sticky tape. We went to 3M, the real Scotch tape people. Not only did they make us tape that would not leave any residue on the shroud, they also tweaked the optical characteristics of the mylar base of the tape so we could do specific kinds of photomicroscopy right on the tapes. A little different than what Max was doing. And then Max goes over to the face, and he's about to stick the tape on the face, and one of our team members, John Jackson, runs over, grabs him, and literally physically drags him away from the table. And if it looks like they're about to hit each other, they were. And the man in the middle is acting as the referee. That's Professor Ganella, who is the Archbishop's scientific advisor. See, now this isn't what you expect in a scientific examination. Professor Ricci goes next. He's an Italian. he decides to separate the shroud from the backing cloth that was sewn on after the fire to give it more stability, and insert a camera and a vacuum between the two. Brilliant idea. He was given 2 weeks, no budget. Think of something, because you have to go before the Americans. And that prompted me to make this photo, which you may have seen. It's probably the most well-known of the photos I made in '78. It is the first moment where we saw the backside of the shroud in 450 years. I'm not sure what the sister was thinking, but I don't think she was thrilled. Those are her hands, and she's removing a sample. And this is what Baima Bologna got. Okay, this is the Italian research. Now, I'm sorry, because time is up. I'm going to just kind of go through this. I want to show you this is very important, and then I'm probably going to stop after this. Professor Rigi understood that if he wanted to photograph the back of the shroud, how are you going to know exactly where you're looking? So he had a 10-centimeter grid of string made because his camera had a 10-centimeter diameter angle of view. You could see a circle 10 centimeters. So he puts it on the cloth, he centers the camera's focusing light underneath, and now he knows precisely what he's looking at the backside of. Think how brilliant and simple that is. Good scientists. We saw this, and what did we learn from this at that moment? We learned that the blood had soaked into the cloth, and when you transmit light through it, it's more dense there. Now think about this. If somebody had applied some form of paint or pigment, it too would have probably soaked in. It has to be applied generally with some kind of a liquid or viscous liquid. If it soaked in, if we photograph the whole shroud with transmitted light, we should then be able to see the paint if it's there. So I did. And look, blood stains, scorches, blood stains, water stains, burns, holes, patches. No image, because the image is only a few microns on the top surface of the fibers. It didn't penetrate into the cloth. It's not a painting. Sorry, Hugh. And here's the reference. So you can see where the image is. Now, I could go on for an hour. My normal talk is an hour and a half plus questions, but we don't have the luxury of that time at this moment. And I apologize for that, but I have to tell you that I'm pretty excited about the idea of going into the big tent and addressing the large group. And so what I want to do is, I'm going to come to the end, but I'm going to just tell you something. When I started this, I didn't want to do this. I was uncomfortable doing this. But in the end, after 20 years, I kept thinking, why am I part of this? Why was I? See, I was thinking about myself. But after a while, it occurred to me that I wasn't in that room for me. I was in that room for you. To be the eyes for those who could not be there. I was given a great privilege, which brought with it an obligation. And that is to take what I accumulated, bring it together, and bring it to you, to whom this truly does matter. So I'm sorry to stop in the middle, but my time is up. So I want to say thank you for your attention. It's a bit warm, I understand. And we'll have a few minutes for some questions. And so thank you very much for this. And now I'm ready to take some questions.